As it is time, we'd like to start the session. Thank you for joining us at the webinar series co-organized by Sasakawa Peace Foundation and Conciliation Resources, the launch event for Accord number 29, Pioneering Peace Pathways, Making Connections to End Violent Conflict, and the new report, Public Support for Peace Building, Public Attitudes in Japan Towards Peace Building and Dialogue with Armed Groups. We appreciate your kind participation. I'll be serving as the master of the ceremony today. And with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Nakayama is my name. I look forward to your kind support and cooperation. First, I'd like to invite Dr. Atsushi Tsunami, President of Sasakawa Peace Foundation, one of the co-organizers, to give opening remarks. So, Dr. Tsunami, please.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I am so pleased to see so many of you joining us for this webinar. Originally, we were supposed to have the seminar at our International Conference Hall of SPF, together with our co-organizer, Conciliation Resources, to be invited to have the launch the seminar. But because of the pandemic, we have switched to webinar. But as a consequence, I am so delighted that there are so many who are participating in this webinar. And today, we will be taking up the topic of peace building, and especially the mediation and conciliation towards the solving of the conflicts, and also peace mediation support to create and set the stage and environment for or mediation to take place. There are many challenges worldwide, including the refugees issues, which are caused by violent conflicts. But we need to seek the methodologies other than using force to have political solution through dialogue. And there are rising needs globally for this. We would like to have even more activities worldwide with the international institutions and also the governments from the Western countries and NGOs to be active. And today we are pleased to have with us who have been very active for many, many decades and who have been working closely with us for the survey as well as the launching of the Accord, the Conciliation Resources from the United Kingdom. It has been a great honor for us to be able to work closely with Conciliation Resources. We were able to have a good learning through the working together for a conflict resolution on various occasions. And we are also very pleased to have Professor Hoshino of Osaka University, who have just returned to Japan. He has been with the Deputy Permanent Representative, as well as an ambassador of the government of Japan, a representation at the United Nations for 3 years. And we would like to express our gratitude to Professor Hoshino, who had been working closely with us from a decade ago. And I'm looking forward to many suggestions to be given on the peace building activities of Japan. And there are many activities seeking for political solutions that the world over, the countries are involved in the different conflicts resolution, and government Japan has also been involved in Mindanao as well as Sri Lanka and also Aceh in Indonesia. But apart from these experiences, we have not been that active for peace mediation support. But the SPF have started support to the ethnic minorities in Myanmar from 2012, and Nippon Foundation that has been very active, and the chairman Sasakawa as a representative of government of Japan, utilizing the budget from the government. He has been very, very active in playing the role to support the peace process in the region. And from 2010, SPF, for many, many years, have been working in the deep south of the Thailand, at the border of with the Malaysia. We have been involved with the various activities in bringing solutions to the ethnic minorities in Myanmar and elsewhere. We hope to be very close to the local community, and we have accumulated experience. And based upon our experience, as well as the challenges that we are still facing, the Accord the publication will be able to give you the good learning experience, verifying the practices of conciliation resources worldwide to introduce the peace mediation support activities. And today, we are also pleased to introduce the findings of the survey done in Japan on peace building. We hope that we will be able to think together with all of you as to what the role should be played by Japan going forward for conflict resolution. Thank you for your kind attention.
Next, from Conciliation Resources, our co-organizer, I would like to invite Mr. Jonathan Cohen, Executive Director, for his remarks. Mr. Cohen, please.
Thank you very much. And it's a real honor to join you all today and to be able to be creative in the spirit of peace building and transfer this event online in the way we have. And it's wonderful to have the audience that we have. Conciliation Resources is an international organization committed to stopping violent conflict and creating more peaceful societies. Over the last 25 years, we've worked with people impacted by war and violence, seeking to bring diverse voices together to make change that lasts. And a critical concern for us through all this period is how do we connect the views and experiences of those people who directly experience the devastation and the disruption of violent conflict? How do we connect their views with those who shape and influence political processes? We believe that sharing this experience and also bringing expertise into the equation is absolutely essential to help find creative responses to conflict. And as an organization, we work in more than a dozen conflict regions around the world, from the Philippines, from the Pacific region, to Kashmir, to the Caucasus, to Ethiopia, Nigeria, Central African Republic, and Colombia as well in the past. And in these efforts, critical to our thinking is how do we make peace processes more effective? And the work we're presenting today speaks to the spirit of inquiry that is central to our organization. My colleagues will introduce the survey on public support for peace building that was undertaken in Japan. And this builds upon earlier surveys that we undertook in the United Kingdom, the United States and Germany. And my colleagues will explain why doing such research is important for us what the findings can help us do in promoting awareness of peace building options. We're also going to present our most recent Accord publication on pioneering peace pathways. And this is part of a long-running series that we've been publishing throughout our 25 years of existence. And this is around the aspiration to deepen the understanding of peace and conflict and to raise awareness of strategies and options to promote peace in very practical ways, giving people who are part of peace processes the opportunity to reflect on their experience and to shape how others approach similar challenges in their own context. So this commitment to comparative learning and a commitment to being inquisitive about the root causes of conflict and around the diverse ways in which peace building can be progressed is central to our identity as an organization. Also central to our identity is the notion of working in partnership. And it's been a real honor over the last 6 years to develop the partnership with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, initially through some collaborative support that we were able to provide in work that the Sasakawa Peace Foundation has long been doing in the deep south of Thailand, and subsequently bringing together our respective experience in trying to deepen understanding of the challenges of peace processes. So we look forward to today's event as an opportunity to have a broader conversation with our colleagues from across Japan and many of our colleagues from Conciliation Resources based here in Europe as well as in Australia are joining us today. And we hope that this will be an inspiring and invigorating discussion. So thank you all ever so much for joining us, and I look forward to the ideas that will be presented.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tsunami and Mr. Cohen. So let us go on to session 1. Report on Japan survey. Let's go on to the presentation about the Japanese awareness. For your reference, this report and Accord 25, which will be the basis for session 2, are downloadable from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation's website. Please take a look at these documents as well for your reference. So without further ado, let us go on to session 1. I'd like to introduce the speaker for the first session. The first speaker is the Director of Policy and Learning at Conciliation Resources, Dr. Teresa Demasi. She leads CR's work to share evidence and learning with international policymakers and promote peace-building responses to conflict. She also coordinates UK's NGA efforts to address the impact of counterterrorism legislation and sanctions on humanitarian and peace-building work. So that is the introduction of Dr. Teresa Demasi. Then without further ado.
Thank you. So what do the public think about peace building? Do they know what it is? Do they support it, and why? These were questions that we asked in national public opinion surveys in the UK, US and Germany in 2017 and in Japan in December 2019 through a survey commissioned together with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. These are not just interesting questions for us as organisations already working on peace support. They are, we believe, essential questions for governments and international organisations to ask when they're thinking about how to find and prioritise ways to build sustainable peace. And as has been mentioned, the need to do so is urgent. Today's conflicts are increasingly complex and protracted, and now being exacerbated by COVID-19 and the climate crisis. And the number of active conflicts has grown over recent years, as has the number of people who are forcibly displaced by violent conflict. So what is peace building? Well, it is an approach to conflict which focuses on the understanding and addressing the underlying causes and drivers in order to prevent the outbreak, continuation, and recurrence of violence. And despite being an international priority, policy priority, globally it is under-resourced. Spending on conflict, peace and security represents on average 2% of total aid from the OECD donors. In addition, the survey asked the public for their views on talks and negotiations with armed groups in the pursuit of peace, including about engagement with officially prescribed or terrorist organizations. This is one of the most sensitive areas of peace building, but it's often a necessary strategy to make the transition to peace. Therefore, getting a sense of the level of public support or tolerance of this work and who should do it is important data to build strategies for mediation and peace building and to protect the space for this work. So what do we find? Well, first of all, we found that people in Japan recognize the importance of peace building. A significant majority, 77%, agreed with the statement that peace building plays a vital role in ending violent conflicts around the world. And this was higher than in the UK in 2017, which was 71%, and slightly lower than Germany, 82%. Furthermore, just under half of the respondents, that's 46%, agreed that there should be greater investment in peace building. This was somewhat lower than in the UK, 60%, and Germany, 70%. But few actively disagreed with this statement, and a good proportion remained undecided, 39%. And this indecision was a bit a pattern across the survey. Thirdly, we found that people in Japan, as in the UK, US and Germany, have a good understanding of what peace building is. And we tested this by presenting people with 8 statements from which they could choose 3 that they felt best described peace building. Their choices showed that people understand efforts to build peace as long-term, people-centered and inclusive. And military intervention and diplomatic deal brokering were the least popular responses. In the Japan survey, in contrast to the others, included in their top 4 choices, 33%, was a description of peacebuilding as the provision of aid to people who have been displaced or harmed by violent conflict. This is more a description of humanitarian aid, so dealing with the consequences of conflict rather than the conflict itself, but no doubt shows that the link that people make to Japan's significant support to humanitarian crises. And it was closely followed by the 4th choice, which was that peacebuilding involves everyone, which was similar to the other surveys. And then fourthly, the survey showed that people's support for peacebuilding is motivated predominantly by moral considerations. 80% chose the following justification for peacebuilding: because human beings have the right to live in peace, free from the threat of conflict. This was similar to previous surveys where across all 3 countries, 84% of respondents agreed with the statement. And only 15% of those interviewed believed that there was no responsibility to address conflict in other countries. Finally, the questions about engagement with armed groups showed strong public support for this as a strategy to end conflict. There was a greater support for international organizations like the UN to do so, and slightly less support for the Japanese government, non-profit organizations and local communities to do so, with 59, 54 and 48% respectively. And when asked about engagement with prescribed terrorist organizations, there was an overall decline in levels of support, showing that labeling a group as a terrorist alters public perceptions of engagement. However, overall, support remained relatively high for talking, mediating, or negotiating with these groups. And we saw this in the other surveys in 2017 as well. Just to conclude then, the Japan survey and those carried out in the US, UK, and Germany are the first national surveys to provide insight into the level of existing and potential public support for civilian peace promotion and engagement with armed groups. And the report we've produced includes examples of what this looks like, what this long-term work looks like in practice in the Philippines, Southern Thailand, and the Horn of Africa, as well as the difference it can make. And so we hope that the results encourage governments, international organizations, and civil society to more confidently prioritize, promote, and invest in this vital part of foreign and development policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we'd like to go on to expert with JICA, Mr. Akihito Hayashi. He previously worked at the Asia Peace Initiatives Department at Sasakawa Peace Foundation. He was the program officer, and he worked to build media networks in Southeast Asia. And he also focused on peace building and dialogue with armed he conducted a survey on public attitudes in Japan about peace building and dialogue with armed groups. He's currently a visiting fellow at Sophia University's Institute of Asian, African, and Middle Eastern Studies. Mr. Hayashi, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. My name is Hayashi. I was with the Asia Peace Initiatives Department at Sasakawa Peace Foundation. I'm now an expert at JICA, but I was responsible for the survey while I was at Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So I would like to talk about this survey if I may. So let's talk about the backdrop and the objective and the comparison of this survey. I think this was already covered by Dr. Dumasi in her presentation. So therefore, I would like to talk about how this could be understood in the context of Japan. That's what I would like to focus on. As far as the major trend is concerned, I would like to introduce some of the major findings and also what implications there are for the Japanese civic society and for the society. That is what I would like to focus on in my presentation. So let me talk about the survey finding. At the first point, here we talk about to what extent the people in Japan supports peace building. And this slide shows that result. As you can see, 77% of the people understand the importance, the vital role of peace building. So it could be said that Japanese public support peace building efforts. So from that result, the government there's room for the Japanese government to more actively undertake peace building efforts going forward. And the second point, this was already covered by Teresa. To what extent Japanese people understand peace building? This is what the question addresses. The result is that there is deep understanding, good understanding of what peace building is. And we asked them to select several statements. And we have shown 3 statements that were selected by the Japanese public. The first, peace building involves understanding and addressing the underlying drivers of conflict. Many people chose this statement. The second one is that peace building is the long-term process of rebuilding relationships, changing attitudes, and establishing fair institutions. These reflect the major concept of peace building. So people have deep understanding about what peace building entails. On the other hand, as was mentioned by Teresa, the third selected phrase was this. This released assistance to the people. This was focused primarily on physical aid. And I think it's akin to humanitarian assistance. This, I believe, is the central philosophy of peace building. So therefore, maybe there is a gap, perhaps, on this topic. So from this result, it could be said that people are not looking for short-term results. They have understanding that peace building can entail long-term commitments, and there is support for that. The third is the motive for addressing peace building efforts. It's not so much peace building should be implemented, not so much by physical gain, but more for moral considerations. The most selected option was that people have the right to live in peace and be free from the threat of conflict. That was the most frequently chosen response. And very close to this concept is that the Japanese government, they carry out a survey about diplomacy. And in the same Japanese government diplomacy survey, they ask the same question, but they focus on energy, and they have a question, and there is a response that people should pursue assistance because of gaining physical gains, such as sustained stable supply of oil. However, in this particular survey that we carried out, there's predominant focus on moral considerations as the motive for supporting peace building. We need to elaborate on this further, but the legitimacy, when we discuss the legitimacy of addressing peace building, I think we should stress the importance of the moral responsibility and moral considerations as we try to pursue further peace building efforts. The fourth topic, through what measures should we address peace building activities? That was the question put forward. Here, we ask about military and non-military responses to conflict. Which of the options are chosen? We have in Japan, in the post-war era, we have not had much activities of the SDF. And when peacekeeping became allowed, at last this became possible. So through what measures should Japan address peace-building activities? So that was the question put forward. In this question, majority of the people responded to question 1, and less than 50% of the people responded to the second question. So the question, Japan should contribute through civilian peace promotion, such as facilitating dialogue between groups in conflict. And that outweighed contribution to military means. And of course, most of the contribution is through UN, but direct involvement in dialogue between those in conflict, that option should be actively considered. That, I believe, can be dialogue between parties to the conflict. In this question, we cite whether or not they support various actors such as the government and the NGOs involved in engagement with armed groups. While they support international organizations' engagement with armed groups, there was actually quite a gap between different actors in Japan. Direct as an actor to have direct engagement with armed groups, NGOs and regional local communities are not considered as a possible option. But then actually on the ground, we found that local community and the NGOs play a very important role in resolving various conflicts. And also within Japan, there seems to be a certain level of support for the direct engagement by these actors. So I think Japan is expected to pursue policy for enabling NGOs and local communities to be part of this engagement process. We hope that this point could be addressed toward the latter half of our session today. Lastly, one general trend observed throughout the whole of the survey conducted here in Japan, we found that the undecided response was quite large across all parts of the survey. I have just cited just one example here. A question was asked as to whether they agree or disagree with increased investment in peace building, and 39% of the people said they neither agree nor disagree. This is the largest percentage. The reason is that information or data based on which they could make that decision was probably not available here in Japan. So that being the case, when you consider this, not just the government, but private sector organizations like Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the civic society should really communicate what entails peace building. That type of public information education needs to be provided here in Japan. So that is all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
So now we would like to move to session 2, which is the court presentation and discussion. The first speaker would be Mr. Zandaran Spotsam, who is the director of the Conciliation Resources, who will be presenting to us the publication Accord for the series.
Hi, thank you very much. Thanks for everyone for coming to this event. Very exciting to be here. It's been a long time producing this publication and we are very excited to be launching it now. A big thank you to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for supporting us in this endeavor and working with us all the way through it. It's been a very productive relationship and we are very pleased and proud with where we've got to. I'll say a little bit now about Conciliation Resources Accord publication and program and introduce this publication before handing it over to our specialist editor, Kate Buchanan. Violent conflicts are increasing, becoming more intense, complex, and persistent. The number of people displaced by violent conflict is at a record high and getting higher. Conflicts are getting harder to resolve. New causes of conflict emerge all the time, from climate change to fracturing of armed groups and proxy wars. Conflict reverses development. The World Bank calculates that violent conflict brings an annual loss of up to 8.2% GDP growth in affected countries. The need to find better ways to resolve conflict is urgent, but investment in peace is tiny compared to global military expenditure, around 0.5%. Peace does not happen spontaneously. It needs energy, commitment, and ingenuity. It needs investment of time and resources and willingness to take risks. And it needs knowledge about how peace works. There are lots of barriers to building peace that need to be overcome. People invested in war do not change course easily. They need to be persuaded and assisted. People struggling for peace need support and solidarity to sustain their efforts and have their voices heard. Conciliation Resources Accord series tries to build and share understanding of how societies move from war to peace, of how peace processes and mediation work, how they don't work, and how they can work better. We're trying to understand what are the new challenges facing peace and peace building and mediation. How are people trying to overcome them? What are the new ways that they're experimenting with? For example, something we talk about a lot in this publication is how can technology help connect people affected by violence to find ways out of it? Accord looks at different themes, like today's theme of how to get peace processes started. In the past, we've also looked at things like how you engage rebel groups, non-state armed groups in peace talks, how to open up peace processes and mediation to involve the public, or how mediation can work across borders. We also look at specific country cases, from Somalia to Nepal to Cambodia and Afghanistan. Accord has been running for as long as Conciliation Resources, for more than 25 years now. And you'll see that today's publication is number 29 in the series. Accord, we really try to prioritize practical learning about peace processes. We want to know what people are actually doing to reduce violence and promote dialogue. And for a long time, Conciliation Resources, but Accord too, have stressed the importance of inclusion. We believe that inclusion is essential for equitable, but also for effective peace building. Accord workshops and publications prioritize people with hands-on experience of war and of peacemaking, with a range of different expertise and experience, from governments to rebel groups, women's peace activists, human rights advocates, senior international diplomats, and expert analysts. And all these different groups are represented often directly in our publications and in our activities. To give you an example, yesterday we held an online workshop looking at ceasefire in Afghanistan. We had over 50 participants from around the world, and we had presentations from a senior member of the Afghan negotiation team, government negotiation team involved in peace talks with the Taliban in Qatar, the Afghan Minister for Human Rights, a senior Afghan general, and a civil society Afghan peace builder negotiating local ceasefires with the Taliban. This was part of a series of workshops to explore how ceasefires can be more effective to enable peacemaking, and there'll be a report out on that later in the year. So to introduce the publication we're looking at today, this is exploring early peacemaking and how peace processes start. Often when reflecting back on a peace process, on what has gone well and what has not, it's easy to forget how the process started. Before dialogue gets off the ground, when fighting may be intense or has been going on for many years, peace talks seem like an impossibility or way, way off in the future. Speaking to people embroiled in war, there is often as much despair as there is hope of prospects of a way out. This project really grew out of conversations that we have been having over quite a few years with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, often talking about their experiences of supporting peace in southern Thailand and the years of struggle to get a peace process off the ground there. We were interested to learn what we can understand from experiences in southern Thailand, and also what experiences from other peace processes around the world could maybe contribute to the situation in southern Thailand and efforts there. Getting adversaries to talk is a first priority for peace, but it's often the first hurdle too. Peace processes often get stuck or break down before they even get going. In Afghanistan, it has taken the conflict parties many, many months even to start talks. And even now, a workable peace accord is likely many months or even years away. And lots of work is needed in the talks in Doha, but also outside them to keep the peace process moving forward. How peace talks start affects how they continue, and so how transformative and sustainable they are. Much preparatory work is needed to convince state and non-state armed actors to abandon unilateral, coercive approaches to achieving their objectives and seek a negotiated settlement. This can involve transforming relationships between warring parties so they're prepared to enter into dialogue and achieve progress there. Finding ways to engage local populations and political blocs outside of the conflict parties in peace talks and peace initiatives. Securing safe physical or political space for dialogue to start while violence is ongoing. For example, peace or de-escalation zones. Rebel groups are set up to fight, not to talk. Much work is needed to prepare them for dialogue and negotiation, and then ultimately to enter into non-violent politics. But national militaries too need to prepare for peace. For example, to rethink their objectives, strategies and tactics away from achieving military victory and towards winning a negotiated peace. This is very difficult for lots of national militaries to do and is quite a big part of getting a peace process started. War is self-sustaining. How it is waged creates its own barriers to peace. For example, propaganda. Discrediting the enemy as terrorists may be a useful war tactic, but it makes it much harder to talk to them, let alone to reach a deal that a population will then support. So we talk about lots of different things in this publication, but one of them is preparing conflict parties for dialogue. Even when it seems glaringly apparent that a military victory is unachievable, moving to dialogue is often still a quantum leap for conflict parties. Conflict parties are often resistant to dialogue, wary of its implications, or unsure how to go about it. And as I mentioned, this applies both to state and non-state parties. Concessions required for dialogue, or even just implied by it, are often unwelcome and unfamiliar and present a difficult threat to the cohesion of armed groups. Third parties can help conflict parties move towards dialogue by working through how objectives may evolve through a dialogue process over time as part of their negotiation strategy, or connecting parties' leaderships with their wider constituencies to prepare both for the demands of dialogue and to think strategically about achieving their ambitions realistically. So there's a little taster of what Accord tries to do and what how it fits in with Conciliation Resources, and a short introduction to what we've been looking at and exploring in this latest publication. And so I will finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramthabotham. Next, we'd like to go on to the Mediation Support and Process Design Specialist, Ms. Kate Buchanan. She'll be sharing with us the major findings from Accord number 29, Pioneering Peace Pathways. Positive roles for Conciliation Resources, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, UN Mediation Support Unit, and the International IDEA and UNFPA Myanmar. So I would like to invite Ms. Buchanan, please.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Good evening and good afternoon and good morning to everybody in different locations around the world. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you very much to Sasakawa Peace Foundation for making the Accord possible with this incredibly flexible and adaptive funding. And I'm going to touch on that in a little while. And thanks to Conciliation Resources for giving me this fantastic opportunity to be the editor, particularly to reflect on some of my own work over the past years, but also to reach out to colleagues as well as to identify new and upcoming practitioners and give them the space to put forward their ideas. And I think the point that Zan makes about how established the Accord publication series is important to re-emphasize. It is in the peace and security community that, in my opinion, the most interesting and always eclectic, highly practitioner focused publication, and its long-standing nature is also part of its strong credibility. So it's been a huge honor to be a part of it. But what do we mean by early and pre-formal? When we talk about this as a concept and as a phrase, what do we mean? So we wanted to try and unpack the part of peace processes that is in some ways the most obscure, the most difficult to see, the one that is opaque and takes a very, very long time to fully understand. So when we talk about early and pre-formal phases, we're talking about maybe the many years, sometimes decades, that it takes to convince, to encourage, to nurture, to foster conflict parties and the communities that are affected by that violence and that conflict to dialogue, to take that huge big risk, that big leap to engage each other and find a negotiated settlement. We also are understanding the early and the pre-formal phases as linked to the collapsed peace processes that we see all around the world, the ones that are stalling, that are breaking down, that are relapsing. So in those moments of collapse, there are opportunities to reconfigure and re-understand and find another path to getting back to dialogue. So the Accord tries to look at some of the almost magical, sometimes mysterious ingredients for encouraging parties to dialogue and helping them to stay connected to each other. So when we are using this term, we don't also mean it in a linear way, that it's sequenced, that there are peace talks, then there is an agreement, then there is elections, and then there is democracy, and everything is okay. It is far more messier than that. And as both Zand and Jonathan referred to, we're now living in an era of incredibly toxic international and geopolitics. We're seeing a new form of information warfare with the use of technology and social media. We're seeing the weakening of multilateral institutions, and we're in general seeing a real loss of appetite for risk-taking for peace and security. The COVID era is also highlighting the perils and the dangers of nationalisms and populist politics. And we're seeing a lot of states and communities drawing into themselves. And so we have a rocky period ahead. I wanted to just to give you a little bit of a sense of who the writers are in the Accord. Dan mentioned the many different types of people that contribute to the Accord, and that is why it's always so interesting and has such high standing. So for Sasakawa Peace Foundation to be investing in the Accord, this is a high benchmark in the peace and security community of quality. So in the Accord, we see people who are local mediators, advisors, negotiators. We see people who've been members of armed groups, who are analysts, who are advocates in different ways. We have some less established authors and practitioners, and we wanted to give them some space to find a way to articulate their experiences. So the editorial team accompanied several people to try and bring their experiences to light. And we also placed a great emphasis on having a significant number of women as writers, as peer reviewers, and of course on the editorial team. And we also wanted to try and create space for younger people as well. So all of this is to say that not only did we place a value on inclusion in peacemaking, but we also tried to exemplify that and walk the talk in our own effort of pulling the Accord together. So I wanted just to come back to some of the key messages in the Accord. As we've said, the first one is that peacemaking, the efforts to facilitate, negotiate, and mediate in violent conflicts is under intense pressure. At no time have we seen the type and the nature and the duration of the conflicts that we have, but also we have such a fragmented international system at the moment. We also have a proliferation of peace and security actors, and this can be a really positive thing because there's lots of ideas and dynamism, but it's also a highly challenging thing because it demands a lot of coordination. And one of our key messages in the Accord is that we are encouraging all those involved in peacemaking to not just coordinate, but to be collaborative in their coordination and to play to their strengths and recognize their weaknesses. Not everybody has to do everything. The second message is that peace processes benefit from adaptive and flexible and proactive support from third parties, be they international non-government organizations, private diplomacy organizations, such as Intermediate or the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, Conciliation Resources, the Berghoff Foundation. These are all a type of organization that are operating in all the cracks and opportunities to build peace. So one of the things that we emphasize is it's not just about reacting to conditions in conflict-affected countries, it's also about making pathways and expanding windows of opportunities. And for this, you need to have very flexible funding sources so that you can make the most of opportunities. And there are several case studies in the Accord, but I think one that really illustrates this is the work of Conciliation Resources in the Ogaden region. And it's very dogged, careful work over many years to work with the conflict parties to find a negotiated solution. Another key message is that investing in conflict resolution and conflict prevention is cost effective, but it requires taking risks and it requires being creative. And again, proactive, flexible support is crucial to this. And what we're seeing in the funding space is much more projectization of peace support, where shorter funding cycles are at play, and this leads to stop-start, disjointed work. Longer term funding ultimately is the best form of funding for this line of work. And the final key message across the Accord is one about disruption of negative path dependencies, and understanding that in the early phases, the pre-formal phases of peace processes, a lot of pathways, a lot of logic gets set down. And one of those is the inclusion and exclusion dynamics that we see plaguing so many peace processes around the world. So thinking about inclusion as early as possible, planning for that, having the political analysis to support that is critical. And that is also why we place such a large emphasis in the Accord on astute, dynamic, inclusive political analysis. The other aspect and the final kind of key message is that we also need to see different types of layers and levels of conflict resolution. And that means being much more attentive to insider mediators, those people who are from conflict affected countries, who are understood to be credible or impartial in some way, and find themselves brokering peace, facilitating peace in different ways. We need to find ways to support those people, to bring out all their capabilities, and to accompany them to be as effective as possible. We also strongly promote working subnationally as well as regionally in the neighbourhood and finding regional solutions. Related to this is an emphasis on supporting civil society at a time when space is shrinking all around the world for civil society to be involved in public life and in putting forward their political perspectives, needs and aspirations. Non-violent movements are often those who take the first steps to try and build pathways to peace. And we need to be smarter and much more agile in the ways that we support them, especially in this incredibly turbulent time. So I wanted to close by a reflection that I think that the Sasakawa Peace Foundation is incredibly well placed to work in the early and the pre-formal phases of peace processes, because it is a foundation, because it can be adaptive, because it can take risks. And we need more donors and donor doers, those who are also practitioners working in this space and finding ways to support these pathways that a lot of more traditional state donors struggle with, because these are too risky, too complicated, and as Teresa mentioned earlier on, are often linked to complex legal frameworks, such as those dealing with prescription and armed groups. So again, thank you to Sasakawa Peace Foundation for making this Accord as dynamic and as interesting as we think it is, and we welcome your feedback on the content. Thank you.
Thank you very much to be able to give us a comprehensive but compact presentation. Very important, the key elements that have been presented. And thank you very much for your kind words on SPF activities. We have now Dr. Akiko Horiba, who is the Program Director of Asia Peace Initiative Department, and she will be talking about the Southern Thailand conflict case. She is involved in women's political participation in Asia, as well as civil society networks in Southeast Asia. She is also a lecturer at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and she is specializing on the conflict analysis as well as Southeast Asia. Thank you for your kind introduction. Thank you. So let me start. This is Horiba from Sasakawa Peace Foundation. First of all, this is taken from the Accord, which is Deep South Thailand case. So this is one case study of the conflict of the Patani. If you look at this map, in the deep south of Thailand, or it is called as Patani region. There are many names given, but from 2004 onwards, there has been conflict occurring here. The majority of the Thai people are Buddhists, but in language and culture, and totally different Malay Muslims are living, about 2 million of them in the border with Malaysia. And 80% are the Malay ethnic group, and there used to be the Patani kingdom in the past. And under the British the rule, there has been agreement that been reached between the Siam and the UK, and the ethnic group totally different from the Siam people have come into this region, and with the assimilation policy taken by the government in trying to achieve a nation state, there have been a crisis over the Malay identity and the armed the groups that have started their resistance. And in the 1990s, the incidents have been reduced, but it has been rekindled in 2004. There have been more than 7,000 casualties so far. For the Malay identity, those who have been treated as second-class citizens are now resisting the Thai government. That is the nature of the conflict. Now, as to the causes of the conflict, I will not go into detail. The topic of the accord is the peace process and dialogue. I would also like to explain about the activities of the SPF. As to the peace dialogue, Indonesia and Switzerland have been working in the past behind the scenes to bring peace. But in February of 2013, the then Prime Minister Thaksin has taken the initiative, but under the INLAC, the government, the peace process negotiation has been started. But then there has been a coup in Thailand, and Prime Minister INLAC has withdrawn and has been shifted to Prime Minister Prayut, the current Prime Minister. And the dialogue has been suspended. And even though the dialogue has been restarted, what we call the safety zone, where ceasefire is being realized, confidence building measures have been progressing. And even so, Malaysia has come in, and there has been a change in the leadership for the negotiation. So the dialogue has been suspended once again. And there has been election in Thailand, and the dialogue has been suspended during the election. And we were hoping that there will be new moves. And in various peace mediation support organizations in Europe has made investment. So the dialogue has been restarted. But because of COVID-19, once again, it is now being put to a halt. In Thailand, as you know, right now, there are demonstrations ongoing out in the streets. And in Malaysia, there is a change of prime ministership, and Patani conflict has been forgotten. Even so, 60,000 or so of the security forces are occupying the Patani region. So in the deep south of Thailand, when you watch what is happening in Patani, the peace process is a stop and go process. It is highly complicated a situation. So what the accord is focusing upon, where the peace dialogue has been just started, it is even more difficult. I'm sure you can understand as such. So in Patani, SPF, for about 10 years that we have been involved to provide indirect support for the peace dialogue. We have been working with Think Tank in Thailand, and we have been working in a partnership with the peace dialogue team of the Thai government at the practitioners at the level. what we call the safety zone to be created. We have been supporting the conferences and the meetings that we have been supporting the different teams in trying to build trust and confidence amongst the different groups. But then what is called the Mara Patani, which is an integrated the grouping of the armed forces. But in particular, we have to support the consensus building with the BRN, especially the working and approaching the group, which is close to the armed the group under the BRN. And we wanted to further deepen understanding on the dialogue for the peace the process. And apart from that, we have been trying to strengthen our cooperation with the civil society in the local community. And especially when we have analyzed the characteristics of BRN, we have to think in long term. We thought that it would be important to work in partnership with the civil society. So that is our strategic thinking. And now, let me give you some of the salient characteristics of the BRN. BRN is an urban guerrilla organization. It is an underground organization. Who are the members? Who is the leader? Are not really known. And the members of the BRN in the local community are living together with the community and supported by the residents. And there are young BRN members who are involved in the attack incidents as well as bombing incidents. And the leadership of BRN has evacuated to Malaysia. But the BRN itself is not involved in any smuggling or production of the weapon. They tend to take away the weapons from the national army and so forth, or to try to work at the kitchen stove to have a bombing devices attached and so forth. So it is an urban guerrilla type of organization. And those groups are trying to approach them for the peace talks. They're trying to seek for the leaders of the BRN, trying to convince them to come to the dialogue. And that is the objective and the target. It is more of a top-down process. But because it is an underground organization, those who have come to the table for dialogue may not necessarily be the leaders. And even with the leaders actually coming, who are they representing? The question of legitimacy is the problem. So because of that, the SPF's approach to the BRN would be as follows. Try to work for the youth group and NGO and the community groups who are said to be close to the BRN. Try to involve the local community residents, because BRN is working closely with the community. Without the support of the people, they cannot really survive. Through different trainings and the seminars, we are trying to approach the youth that violence does not bring solution, and they are seeking for more of a political approach, and there has been changes seen in their attitude. I'm sure will be having good impact on the BRN, and through different activities, their understanding and the attitude towards the peace that have been changing. We are often stating that you should not be afraid of negotiation. You should not negotiate because of fear. And that is what we are always persuading, and they are beginning to understand this. And we need to have them learn from the case studies from the other countries. And the importance of BRN to clearly indicate that political demand is now being increasingly understood. And as we have understood the salient features of BRN, to change the attitude and the perception through bottom-up process may be time-consuming, but we are able to see more of a capacity building, especially for the youth, For more than 10 years, we have been involved with Patani in the deep south of Thailand. We have learned many things. I would like to give you some important points. As Kate and others have already spoken of, we need to have good understanding of the culture and religion in the conflict, the communities. And we need to have inclusion to meet the different actors, to collect the information. We have to have our foot on the ground. We have to be there on the ground to have such communication. And not only that, we need to have actor mapping to look at the relationship between the different people and different groups. We have done that. And also to make political analysis and the information to be updated, including the countries in the surrounding area. If we do not understand the human relationship in the conflict space, we may have some adverse effect. As a donor, we may sow the seeds for further conflict without knowing it ourselves. And as I have written in the accord, the donor and doer, we will be active not only as a donor, but we have to be also be doers, to be on the ground, to have long-term commitment in the community, in the conflicted area. We need to have commitment with the civil society, and what we need to be would be the critical friend to the community and those who are involved in the conflict. And we are the third party, not take the stance of bringing solution as a third party. We should always be in the behind the scenes, to be a critical friend, to try to provide the indirect support for those who are directly involved to move the peace process forward. And we are working in a partnership with the local researchers in Japan, as well as in the local community, those who have been involved in the past for peace building in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, and other countries, to have specialization of the roles and jobs, to give due consideration to the identity for the conflict, the actors. We need to be very sensitive to their needs. Looking at the recent the cases such as the Patani in Thailand, where the ethnic identity is the focus of the conflict, that the government do not want United Nations or other governments to interfere. And in the case of the government institutions, the person in charge may change in just a few years. So the trust and confidence relationship with the actors is not prolonged. So thus, there is a role to be played by the private sector, the NGOs. Japan has a very good and favorable relationship with the different governments in Southeast Asia. And when we are involved as third party in conflict resolution, we don't have a vested interest at all. So I don't think we will be a threat to the host country. So there should be a greater role to be played by Japan in this regard. So far, Japan, in the area of peace building, we have been putting emphasis on post-conflict, the reconstruction as well as development to be supported. In the area of peace mediation support, the Japanese government needs to be more actively involved, especially in Asia, to take the initiative for conflict resolution. And as we see authoritarian regime spreading, government alone cannot do everything. But on the other hand, there are things that the government alone can do. So we should have a good division of role between the government and the private sector. And we need to share the information and work in close partnership. And taking the case of Mindanao conflict, we have to start commitment when the conflict is occurring in the midst of conflict, and with the networking to be established, I believe post-conflict assistance will be even more effective. So we need to have more debate and discussion as to how we should be involved in those conflicts in the other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dr. Horiba talked about the example from Deep South in Thailand and also Japan's role in peace support. So I'd like to go on to the comment by Professor Toshio Hoshino, professor at Osaka University. His expertise includes the theory and practice of international relations with special emphasis on human security. And until August 2020, he was an ambassador and deputy permanent representative of Japan to the United Nations for 3 years. He was the former vice president of Osaka University as well. Also, from 2013 to 2016, he was the project head of Sasakawa Peace Foundation supported Asia Peace Building initiatives. So, without further ado, Professor Hoshino, please. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to this most productive and meaningful webinar. I think the discussion is very rich in nature, and I'm really taking part with great interest. So let me first start. Dr. Hoshino, I'd like to congratulate you upon the launch of Pioneering Peace Pathways. It's so rich in substance. I've already read through the publication and I would like to pay tribute. And also Dr. Horiba and Nakayama-san of Sasakawa Peace Foundation, you talked about your efforts in Deep South part of Thailand. This indeed is paving the way for peace. I believe this represents one of the best examples. I'm very happy that this example was cited. So Pioneering Peace Pathways, what does that entail? Easier said than done. It requires a lot of patience and a lot of hard work. It is not something that can be easily done, casually done. And as was mentioned by Alexander earlier, peace building takes time, resources, commitment, and knowledge. So many factors are involved in bringing this about. But although it may be difficult, it is also indispensable, isn't it? Without a doubt, this is very difficult, but also indispensable. Then where and how can we start this process? It will be very difficult to, a correction, I think today's webinar is trying to offer a direct response to this very difficult question. So that being the case, I think the session is very timely as well as very interesting and very productive. Now, as for myself, as was introduced earlier by the moderator, my expertise relates to the theory and practice of international relations with special emphasis on human security. And I was with the permanent representative of Japan to the United Nations on 2 occasions, and also I was involved in as the program director for Asia Peace Building Initiative at Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So I think that is the backdrop for me to take part in the webinar today. And again, I was listening to the presentation with a great deal of interest. So in terms of peace building process, what is the significance? What is the role? Bear with us. So the importance of peace mediation and mainstreaming mediation, I think that is one thing that is at play here. So when it comes to peace building, of course, there's the discussion involving the parties to the conflict. Naturally, if you reach an agreement for ceasefire, it seems that even with the ceasefire, in more than 50% of the cases, there is a resurgence of conflict. So in order to establish and consolidate peace after the agreement, we need to focus naturally on the conflict parties. And at the United Nations as well, Secretary General Mr. Guterres is focused on prevention as well. So prevention of resurgence of conflict, that is at play here. And in the UN Charter, Article 7, enforcement of peace. That is also important. But peaceful solution to conflict. This is part of Article 6 of UN Charter. This really set the foundation of the UN activities. And that relates to the importance of the role to be played by peace mediation. But at the same time, as it was mentioned earlier, even if peace agreement is signed, there are many cases where conflict resumes. If that is the case, then Now, should we focus on parties to the conflict, as was mentioned by Dr. Horiba earlier? Even during the conflict, it is important that there be engagement and that international community needs to be involved. There are two things. First, it is important that parties to the conflict come to the table and be involved in the negotiation to achieve peace. And the second point is the substance of the peace agreement. So the substance of the peace agreement, it must be well balanced. That action needs to be delivered, and that needs to be led by the parties to the conflict. So I think indirect support could be rendered to the parties to the conflict. Maybe we could play a peace mediation support could actually offer, if you will, a catalyst for such a process. So that's one takeaway. Now, with regard to peace mediation support, as was mentioned by President Tsunami at the beginning in his remarks, there are several examples already. In Cambodia, Mindanao, Sri Lanka, there are such cases already. And also, President Sasakawa himself is involved in Myanmar peace process as well. But we have not yet seen full-fledged efforts in this area. So that is why in today's webinar, we should, together with Conciliation Resources, having the discussion is very meaningful. Now, at Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Dr. Horiba and Ms. Nakayama is analyze the deep south in Thailand. And you have continued on with very steady activities up until now. So this is part of the international cooperation. You're on the ground. And how can we bring about peace mediation? Your proposal to further expand peace mediation, I believe, was most significant. Then that being the case, how can we effectively pursue peace mediation support? What can be done to effectively pursue peace mediation support? And the second important point about the webinar today is to draw out lessons, recommendations to provide effective mediation support. In particular, Kate talked about pre-formal, early phase peace process. These are very important keywords. So taking the first step, this I believe is very important. So how do we get there? How do we take that first step? I think you've really identified the importance of taking the first step, and that is very significant. Furthermore, with regard to peace mediation support, Jonathan said that the voice of the people on the ground, people affected by the conflict, needs to be reflected. It needs to be, that I believe was a very impressive comment. And also Alexander talked about the importance of inclusion. And also Kate talked about the flexibility to capture the window of opportunity. So she talked about long-term engagement, inclusive of financial engagement over the long term. So I believe that we've been able to gain so many insight from the presentations today, and this is very, very important. At the same time, with regard to the deep south in Thailand, Dr. Horiba also mentioned that due to COVID-19 and due to the political situation in countries such as Thailand and Malaysia, the interest on the part of the international community is weakening, and the interest toward these issues have weakened. But I believe this is a very important issue as well. I think it is important that we have expectation to peace. It is also important that we have the recognition that we are shoulder to shoulder with people who are involved in the peace building process. It's important that we maintain that interest, that spirit of maintaining interest. I believe this is important, and that's another insight which emerged. Now, as for myself, the third party, if a third party is to be an honest broker, then we need to gain the confidence. So I hope with regard to such commitment to become an honest broker as a third party, it is important that we continue to make efforts toward this end. Then that being the case, with regard to Japanese government and the Japanese private sector, do these actors have the capacity and the willingness to take on such roles as a third party honest broker? That I believe is another question. But one of the lessons that we've been able to gain through the webinar today I think is very relevant to this issue. And this leads me to the third point in relation to the please bear with me. The connection to Professor Hoshino has been cut off. I'll resume now. Thank you. I think we need to maintain interest in peace mediation support. I really agree with the importance of peace mediation support, but that this cannot be done by the Japanese government between the private and the public sector in promoting peace mediation support going forward. You talked about the donor and doer. Yes, I believe it was very interesting that you cited both of these functions, donor and doer. And as a scholar, I would like to be the scholar doer. I would like to have adopted the identity of scholar doer. I think we need to analyze the dynamics of conflict. In one of the initiatives at Sasakawa Peace Foundation, there is the Asia Peace Building Initiative. And that, I believe, really maximizes and leverages the know-how with regard to regional studies. And this really helps to form the strategy for peace building in various regions. But at the end of the day, as Alexer mentioned, Conciliation Resources published Accord series. You produced the Accord series. And I believe this is very much, and I really believe the two organizations are pursuing similar initiatives. So analysis and financial resources and action. With these three elements, it's important that peace mediation support be promoted. And I hope going forward in Japan, this will become more active. That is my expectation. And as for myself, together with Sasakawa Peace Foundation people, I hope that I'll be able to involve in such a process. I'm looking forward to working together with many of you. And also, as Teresa and Hayashi-san introduced earlier, in the survey, I was encouraged that there was so much positive feedback and responses in relation to peace building contribution by Japan. And with regard to Asia, for Japan, Asia is very important. And I was ambassador to the United Nations. And as a result, I believe that we've been able to develop a sense of affinity to my colleagues. And when it comes to peace building in a nutshell, we transition the people in the conflict areas to the stage of peace. We need to project the legitimacy, if you will, of this transitioning to the peace process. There are several reasons for this legitimacy. First is that Japan itself has, this is from the interpreter, the connection is very bad. Apology from the interpreter. We believe that we have experienced how after the end of the war, we've been able to rebuild lives. Of course, peace building, the connection.
Many different Japanese people say that they do not understand. They are not really sure whether yes or no to the answer because they have not been actually experiencing that they have been beaten to the wall and they have fought hard to build a peace nation. But it is a painful process.
This involves pain. And inclusive of pain, we have sought to build peace here in Japan. That is our experience. When we carry out mediation support, I believe this experience really represents the strength. and I'm looking forward to further building on this concept. Thank you once again for your kind invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hoshino. All the four speakers, Professor Hoshino has given a good summary, and as a scholar doer, even with the COVID-19 pandemic, we should stay close to those people on the ground. We should never ever forget those who are still involved in conflicts, and have given us very encouraging remarks as to the role to be played by Japan going forward. I thank you, and I would like to seek your or support and leadership going forward. Now we would like to have question and answer session. There are already many questions asked. So one by one, I would like to ask the speakers. First of all, on the opinion survey, there is the first question, which is as follows. This is a question to Teresa, perhaps. From the armed forces, dialogue with armed forces, the public support is in existence, but in order to realize the process, what are the obstacles? So this is a question to Dr. Teresa. There's another question on opinion survey, and I would like to ask Ms. Hayashi to respond. And based upon the survey done in Japan, government of Japan, or the civil society organization, or the international institutions, what may be your policy recommendation? So can I ask Teresa and then Hayashi-san to respond?
Thank you. So in terms of the engagement with armed groups, there are, I think, and the obstacles, there are a number of risks. It's a risky endeavour. I think the first to highlight is there are security, physical risks to the people undertaking the work. So that creates, some risk aversion, but people are doing it, has been highlighted in the accord. Secondly, I think there are huge political risks when it concerns a government talking to an armed group. And there's a feeling that by talking or having contact with an armed group, you may legitimize that group. And then particularly here, there's a concern about the press coverage of that and the public outcry, So there's a political calculation, and there's the degree of risk aversion to it as well. Thirdly, I think there is huge legal risks, actually, and these have got greater since 9/11, after which there is a huge number of counterterrorism laws and sanctions which have been put in place, and lots of ramifications of that, including for NGOs and civil society groups. And for example, getting money to fund this work has become very difficult, because banks are subject to the same counterterrorism laws. And this is something that we're working on with NGOs in the UK to try and find exemptions and exceptions to allow this work and humanitarian work to happen. And then I think there's a knowledge gap. As I said, there's a feeling that there's a knowledge gap about the space between fighting and negotiation, and there's a lot of activity that can happen in between that. And as has been highlighted, you can be talking. In fact, you need to talk and have contact with armed groups to understand their motives, and it actually can strengthen the moderates within a group. And so you need to have research on the groups as well, which implies some contact. So I think that in terms of responding to these obstacles, you need to put in place legal safeguards for the work. You need to have greater education about how peace happens and what you need to do to achieve it, both in the public and the policy sphere. And then I think you need to support those early peace efforts. And I think that again links back to these Peace Pathways report, which and support those local actors who are taking the risks and communities who are taking the risks. And for information, when we did the UK survey, we did an extra poll in Northern Ireland, which has suffered violent conflict for many years. And the responses there showed that people had a very high understanding of the role of local communities in engaging armed groups, and also the long-term nature of it. So 74% said that this was a long-term process. So the more people who have lived with conflict, the better they understand how it works.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Mr. Hayashi. Well, thank you very much. Well, then we can provide a recommendation. Well, with regard to the findings of the survey, I believe this itself represents a very strong political recommendation. So with regard to peace building, how much interest do people have with regard to peace building? That type of survey was not done extensively in Japan up until now. So the fact that there is support and understanding of the public toward peace building efforts, I believe is very meaningful, not just to the Japanese government, but also for the civic society as well. And I believe this represents a very strong support for peace building activities by Japan going forward. One other point, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, this was covered by Dr. Horiba's presentation, but I think this also represents another example. For example, the Deep South in Thailand, Sasakawa Peace Foundation is involved. So for a private sector organization to be active, in conjunction with that, I think we were able to represent a case study. And providing such an information about such cases, I believe, will also provide insight to the Japanese government and to the civic society about the possible engagement of the private sector here in Japan. So in conjunction with the new publication by Accord, I hope that as a package, this can be appreciated as a policy package and recommendation. And I do hope the peace building activities in Japan will become even more active going forward. That is my expectation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. So let's go on to another question. Alexander, a question to Alexander. You mentioned that how research can be reflected in the mediation work in the early stage mediation. So how can research be utilized and leveraged in early phase mediation? Alexander, please.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, we talked quite a lot about how we hope that Accord and publications like Accord have a real practical value for peacemaking and peacemakers, which is why we emphasize people with live experience of war and of peace to contribute to it, so we can understand what they actually do, what it entails to do peacemaking. And I think that works out in practice. And so to give you an example, sometimes we do research that very much impacts on a live peace process. And we have a good example in the Accord publication, the Pathways Accord publication that we've done with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Conciliation Resources has worked in the Ogaden region of Ethiopia for a number of years on a peace process there. We've worked in partnership with local peacemakers and with the rebel group there and with the mediators trying to negotiate a peace between the Ogaden National Liberation Front and the Ethiopian government. And that was a very slow, long peace process that was dragged out for very many years. And there were lots of elements to what was blocking it going forward and what managed to unblock that barrier. But one of the elements was that for many years it had been a negotiation between the Ogaden National Liberation Front, the rebel movement, and the federal government of Ethiopia in Addis Ababa. But over time, the political economy in the Ogaden region of Ethiopia had changed a lot. And actually, it's a federal government system in Ethiopia. And so the local authority in the Ogaden region had changed over a number of years and had become more powerful. and people realized this and thought that they needed to do a different type of political economy analysis of the Ogaden region to understand what the different power dynamics of it were. So we, as the sort of research branch of Conciliation Resources, teamed up with our Africa program, who were working directly on the negotiations, and we helped to organize a political economy of the analysis of the Ogaden region at that time, and presented a report saying the situation has changed. We think you need to bring in the local regional government authorities in that region into the mediation process. And because of our relationship with the rebel group and the Kenyan, there was a mediation support team which provided by Kenya at the time. This was quite a controversial thing to present, but we were able to present some difficult information into the peace process at that time. And actually the mediation process then did change. They brought in the regional government into the process, the regional authorities into the process. So that's just a demonstration of how people have mentioned quite a few times this morning of doing good political analysis and how that is important to the early phases. So there's a clear example of how we were able to introduce some research into a very live peace process, and because of the way that it was set up, it had a material impact on what happened. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think there is a whole range of ways that international actors such as Sasakawa Peace Foundation can support civil society and non-violent movement, especially in the coming decades, when we might expect that the space and the ways in which civil society can raise and mobilize political perspectives and demands is going to be incredibly difficult. So why this matters for early peacemaking and pre-formal peacemaking is because we now have a very decisive evidence base, and this is referred to in the Accord, that non-violent movements in civil society are a crucial ingredient in laying down the pathways to peace that are positive and that lead in directions of more inclusive, robust, sustainable peace. And one of the many downsides of civil society organizations and non-violent movements having problems with accessing funding is that it keeps them in a position of undertaking very short-term activities or very short-term projects. And so this impacts negatively their ability to set strategic goals and work towards them. So this is why we place such a great emphasis in so many different parts of the Accord on long-term funding that is either very flexible or potentially more flexible. And what I mean by that is that a donor could provide a mixture, blended funding. Part of it is dedicated to specific activities. It is earmarked, and part of it is unearmarked, that it can be allocated and spent according to strategic goals of the organisation and the opportunities to promote peace dialogue. And when organisations are spending a lot of time fundraising, they are more likely to miss opportunities to seize a moment or make a moment happen, and a moment that can lead to conflict parties starting those different steps that we've been talking about in lots of different ways to a dialogue process. So I think donors can think about blended funding, about taking some calculated risks to invest in longer term support, particularly to organisations at the subnational level, where we now are also seeing very clear evidence that this is where peace is also being nurtured in a lot of different ways. And a lot of subnational organisations have a lot of difficulties in accessing funding. There can also be ways of investing in non-violent movements, which might be more difficult to sort of put your finger on because they are a political movement and they are not necessarily organised into a formal structured organisation that can receive and spend funding. But their political movements, non-violent movements, usually have a constellation, a mixture of formal and informal organisations that are a part of them. And there are different ways that donors could provide funding to some of those organisations for the entire political movement, or donors can provide funding for specific actions or needs. For example, helping non-violent movements with strategic communications. That might be learning how to use social media when it's being used negatively against you, buying advertising space, those kinds of things. And then the final way I think that international actors can really support civil society better and smarter is to also think about roles of accompaniment. In the Accord, we talk a lot about the accompaniment of conflict parties by third-party actors, such as peace support organisations. And that means being present, being proximate, maintaining relationships. But donors can also do that with civil society organisations and work side by side to support them, not in front of them or behind them, pushing them to do particular things and seeking visibility for your own work, keeping a low profile. And I think that's also where the Sasakawa Peace Foundation has so many rich natural added values, because it is humble, it seeks a low profile, it can work discreetly. This is actually a perfect combination for the type of peace processes that we're talking about. You need to have donors that are prepared to be discreet, take the long view, seeing their investments over the long term, not the short term. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very clear-cut, a very comprehensive response. Thank you very much. Next, we would like to turn to another question, a question in Japanese. It's about Japan. With regard to what is it that Japan's efforts in mediation is so limited? What were the key drivers to further drive Japan's active role in mediation? So Dr. Horiba, would you like to take this question, please? And there seems to be another question as well. Another question in Japanese for the Japanese speaker. So allow me to read the question in Japanese. You talked about expanding the scope of activities. You mentioned that this could be a factor of strength going forward. But this is a webinar of people that are interested in mediation and conflict resolution, and inclusive. And we can see the trend of the participants deepening their understanding. But what about the people who are not able to find relevance? So people who do not take part in webinars of this kind, how can we involve those type of people in terms of further driving mediation here in Japan? So Dr. Horiba and Dr. Hoshino, would you like to respond to this question? So I would like to turn to the Japanese speakers. Thank you very much. I'll take this question. So with regard to mediation, the mediation in Japan being limited, that was part of this question. Yes, peace mediation is very political in nature. So you have to, so you can take one side, and that could be very challenging to choose a side. In case of Japan, very few Japanese can get into those conflict regions because of the risks involved. So we simply can't get into regions of conflict. And a very straightforward comparison, humanitarian assistance in very risky zones are being carried out. So why is it that there's little interest of people toward conflict resolution? That is, the humanitarian assistance is more visible. The output is more visible. So what is being done is also visible. It's very straightforward. Humanitarian assistance is much more straightforward. On the other hand, as was mentioned in the discussion today, when it comes to peace mediation, it's very low profile. You have to start with political analysis, robust political analysis, do sufficient research, and then try to identify relations with various human factors. And you have to create a network, build a network, and then get into the process. So it's a very invisible process. And as was frequently pointed out, it has to be done over the long term before you can actually see the results of those efforts. There was reference to the donors, for example. In order to carry out this type of activity, you need long-term funding. That is very critical. But very few donors are willing to invest in this type of process. So, and this, of course, applies on a global scale, but I think that's one reason why very little peace mediation process is being carried out in Japan. So it's not visible, it's not tangible. It's also done in secrecy so that that information simply does not come out. And if you do this based on Japanese government money, then this involves the question of accountability. So it's very difficult to publicize this type of information. So that's one factor probably. And one other point, this relates to, let me see. Now, conversely, what are the keys to drive this type of process? So I think funding would be one driver, and also network. I think network is another key. In order to join people on the ground, you have to be part of the network to do that. So you need connections. You need connections with various people on the ground. And one final point, how do you approach people with very little interest toward this topic? Well, actually, many people from the media are participating in the webinar today. When we do webinar, people who are interested in the topic take part in the webinar. So people who aren't interested aren't aware that there's a conflict going on in the deep south part of Thailand, and they're not aware of the conflicts going on in Southeast Asia to begin with. So I do hope that the media, people from the media, won't just focus on economy. Of course, please don't focus just on the major powers. I hope that the media will focus on regions with great ties to Japan and focus on the negative aspect of the conflict. I do hope that the media will report more on such aspects as well. I know that we're relying on others, but that's my response. And Dr. Hoshino, would you like to respond, please?
Yes, thank you. From my part, how to approach those people who are not interested, those people who do not participate in webinars like the one we are having today. So let me try to make some suggestions. To be direct, in Japan, for the daily livelihood, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, people are more narrow-minded and more looking inwards. Dr. Horiba said that we have very deep and strong relationship and connection between the other Asian countries and Japan. But what about those countries who are farther away from Japan, on the other side of the globe, so to speak? We are not really interested. We are disinterested, so to speak. But we are actually connected in many ways. And that is the product of the globalization. Japan is a member of the world, and Japanese livelihood is connected in many ways with the other economies, with the many other countries, and people must be more aware of this fact. And I believe there is a role to be played by the media, and as I teach at university, so in my own classroom, I try to teach the students what should be the role to be played by Japan in the whole world. And that is what is very necessary in this country, that we need to be more connected. And Japan is actually connected to the whole world. And we have to have that perception always in mind. Thank you. Thank you. I believe this may be the last question. But lastly, there's a question to Jonathan. Now, how can we be able to learn from each other, to think about the organizational partnership? How can we promote such partnership amongst the different organizations? And those who are engaged in peace building on the ground, who are in amidst the conflict affected area, how can we be able to work with them, to connect with them? This is the question to Jonathan. And also, because of the pandemic, the international aid agencies and donor organizations cannot really be closely involved. We are far separated from what is happening in the local communities. What should be the breakthrough to this question? If I could ask this question all of a sudden out of the blue, but Jonathan, if you would be kind enough to answer to both of these questions, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, the second one's quite challenging. I mean, in terms of the first one, partnership is I think so fundamental to what we do as an organization, and I think it's a state of mind, it's an approach to the work, and it shapes how we think about learning. So I'd say that one of the critical dimensions of partnership is that it is about creating a relationship in which you can really challenge one another, and in which you can create the space to explore ideas in new ways. So today, I think, is a good example of partnership in action. It's trying to bridge a geographical gap. It's trying to bring together different communities of actors, people who are deeply involved in peace building, but people who are perhaps looking at it from outside, but with an inquisitive and analytical mindset. And so I think it's about creating spaces where you can have difficult conversations that are not caught up in what we might today call the echo chamber. And it's got to take you outside your comfort zone. So it's not about just talking to people like you. I think partnership is about creating relationships that enable you to go beyond your normal environment and go into different communities in order to ask hard questions, to be asked hard questions, and therefore through that to be able to learn. So good partnership requires a willingness to build trust, to take time. It requires a mindset that is about joint thinking, doing things together, not trying to impose your perspective. So it's really about listening, and it's about being able to hear things that might be uncomfortable for you. But I think this really applies not just to partnerships such as that between the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and Conciliation Resources, which really has been about opening up our minds and asking questions from our different perspectives. But it's about what does it mean to work with people who are exposed to the front lines of conflict, who live through conflict on a daily basis. And many of the points that Kate has made are very pertinent to that as well. And I think perhaps central to that is the notion of long-term accompaniment. And partnership is about a willingness to be with people through very difficult times. We're seeing that at the moment. We've worked for 25 years in in Azerbaijan and Armenia. And now we see the conflict around Nagorno-Karabakh escalating again. And our team that works there is in daily contact with our partners on either side of the conflict divide, listening to them, and because of the relationships, able to ask them uncomfortable questions that challenge them to think about some of what needs to be done to shift the situation forward. So I'd say that it's about not just giving voice to people from conflict regions, because that in many ways can be quite patronizing to give them voice. They have voice. It's about creating the spaces where those voices can be heard. It's about enabling people who, as was said earlier, don't have access to meetings like this as easily, to have their voices and their ideas heard, and sometimes to help them think about how they want to shape their thinking in order that it can effectively influence communities that they're not as accustomed to engaging with. And so if I take this to your next point about what this says for the experience of the pandemic, clearly the pandemic has made it very much more difficult for any of us to travel to the contexts where we work. And there are all sorts of new constraints placed on that travel. But in some ways, we shouldn't treat the pandemic as something too unique, because in a lot of conflict contexts, there are tremendous restrictions on travel anyway. The space for civic action is often very limited. And so I think peace builders have always had to be creative and have always had to think through, how do we find different ways to be in touch with people, to maintain relationships, to get their perspectives, to give them the space to articulate those perspectives, and to create the opportunities for people to work across conflict divides. And that is perhaps one of the most critical contributions that organizations like the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and Conciliation Resources can provide. It's that ability to develop relationships of trust and confidence that enables us to bring people from across conflict divides together, to analyze problems together, to learn from one another, and hopefully to devise creative strategies to move forward in the resolution of conflict. Thank you. And thank you, since I have the final opportunity, perhaps, just a huge thank you to our Japanese friends for this wonderful partnership and for this fascinating discussion today.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've already gone beyond 8 p.m., so we have to conclude the webinar at this juncture. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the wonderful speakers for their insight and wonderful input. We were able to have so much insight from well-experienced people in the field of peace mediation support. So I'd like to thank all the speakers, Dr. Hoshino, Dr. Hayashi, Mr. Hayashi, and also from Conciliation Resources, Jonathan, Zanda, and Teresa, and Kate. Thank you so much. And also I'd like to thank Derek and Kam, who supported the operation of this webinar. Thank you so much to all of you. I would also like to express my gratitude to all the participants. I'm afraid we cannot see your faces, but thank you so much for joining us today. At Sasakawa Peace Foundation, we would like to continue to work on peace mediation support area. We hope to carry out activities in this area, and we will look forward to your continued support and cooperation for our activities down the road. So with this, we'd like to conclude the webinar at this juncture. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.